Welcome to the Latino podcast, where we discuss the intersection of law and our Latino communities with legal, political, and community leaders and visionaries. Let's get started.
Hey, it's Sean Gomez. Welcome to another episode of the Latino, where we discuss the intersection of law and our Latino communities. This episode, as always, is brought to you by your sponsor, Gomez Trial Attorneys, one of our nation's largest Latino-founded consumer rights, civil rights, and personal injury law firm. Today, we're joined by a very, very special guest, very honored. We're here in Houston at the Shades of Mass Conference, a conference committed to increasing diversity in positions of leadership in major litigation. And so we're joined by this gentleman who has traveled to speak to us in just a little bit, get to talk to the whole conference, has come to us from New Mexico out here to Houston, Texas. He's going to be talking to the group as a whole. But first, we have a private conversation with New Mexico Attorney General Raúl Torrez. So thank you, sir, for being here.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so what we do first, tell us a little bit about your childhood, where you grew up, how you kind of got to where you're at right now.
You know, one of the things I always try to warn young attorneys about is the risks of what could happen to your kids if you allow them to hang out around courtrooms and undercover police officers, because, you know, when other families were going on trips that were sort of normal vacations, I was headed down to the border with my dad because he was doing RICO conspiracy trials on behalf of the federal government when I was a little kid. So I would swim at the hotel during the day, and he would go do these multi-co-defendant cocaine cases back then in the 1980s. And at night, all the undercover officers would come over to the hotel, and I would just be fascinated. And I would be a fly on the wall listening to all of these wild stories and hearing about what had happened in the courtroom that day. So I never really knew anything other than that. And when I ended up, after a lot of twists and turns when I was a young man, thinking about whether or not to go into the law, and then once I decided to go to law school, what I was going to do with it, it took me a while to actually end up on the same path that my dad had taken as a career prosecutor. But I got to tell you, it's been the most rewarding thing I've ever done in my life, and has been something that has really enabled me to understand some of the challenges that people in our community face each and every day that kind of are constantly there but don't get recognized as much as they should or elevated as much as they should. And so what I try to do now is to use the position that I have to try and be a voice for people that need it the most. And having worked at various levels of the criminal justice system and now serving in this role, I have the ability to sort of synthesize all of that experience and bring it with me each and every day.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's interesting that what your dad was doing, I did that for a little bit. I was a federal prosecutor in San Diego, first border crimes and then narcotics, doing a lot of the same work that our friend over here, Augustine, is now doing on the state side. And, you know, I always felt, because a lot of the defendants that came before me were, they were either Mexican nationals or they were, American citizens of Mexican descent. And many of them, were acting out of, at least it appeared, economic necessity. And I could make the call. In that position, I had the power to make the call. I was telling Augustine back then, if I had a kid that crossed a load, marijuana, if it was fentanyl, meth or whatever, I didn't have much, discretion, but I could divert that kid. I could be like, okay, if he was a good kid before this, made one error, I could send that kid to I could say, okay, I'm going to divert. If you enlist in the Marine Corps, we're going to, suspend. And I was allowed to do that. And so I felt like, being in the position you're in as really the top law enforcement, official in the state of New Mexico, which is, I believe, just crossed over. It appears demographically just crossed over 50% Latino identification. I think it's super important to have people like you in those positions of authority to make those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it brings an important perspective to an institutional role that just is very consequential for the entire state, but for the Latino community in particular. You know, we were talking a little bit earlier about the kind of unique perspective that I have, not only coming from a family that has been sort of engaged in prosecution and law enforcement for as long as it has, but you know, I'm still cognizant and just aware of how law enforcement isn't always equally applied. One of the sort of really defining experiences of my life came when I was in high school. And I was, driving. I think I was going to pick up a pizza or something like that for my family. And my dad, who grew up very poor in rural New Mexico, decided that he was going to instill in me the virtue of hard work and how much things cost by making me drive an old farm truck, this 1969, 3-gear farm truck that was it was a beast to drive around. Well, he lived in a nicer part of town, and so here I am after dark in this farm truck, and I was pulled over. But I was the subject of a felony stop, and I was ordered out of the vehicle. Guns were drawn, and I was ordered to be face down on the pavement. And I remember being terrified, right? I remember being just not knowing what I had done, not knowing what was going on. And the officers were there, and they were asking me to kind of show my hands, and I was face down. And out of desperation, I said, "Maybe you know my dad." And I used his name, and this officer said, "Oh, you're Press's kid." And no, suddenly all the guns were holstered, and I was allowed to stand up. But I was so humiliated by it, and impacted by it. And I was I was a teenager, so I was probably screwing up the regular amount, but I was a relatively good kid. I wasn't getting in trouble. I had great grades. I was on my way to college. But in that moment, face down on the pavement with guns out, I was a kid that matched the description of a suspect in a vehicle that did not belong in that neighborhood, and that's all it took. And so I went home and shared that story, and I went from being humiliated and scared to being angry. So I had so much anger. And, my dad was upset, but he was also trying to give me a certain amount of perspective on what had gone on. And, the first time I shared that story publicly, I was actually sitting next to the chief of police of the Albuquerque Police Department after I had been elected district attorney. And he had this look on his face like, oh my God, right? And I recognize now, after having served as a prosecutor and having worked with law enforcement, that encounter was originated with certain dynamics beyond my control, and frankly may have simply been a function of me matching the description of a suspect in a vehicle that matched that description at that time. But my perspective when I was a young man was that I had been racially profiled and that the law was treating me differently than other people. I share that story because it's lost on a lot of folks when you are a person of color, and you come from a community that often has, a relationship with law enforcement that can be traumatic. That I always tried to tell young African American and Latino law students, who were almost always more inclined to go into the public defender's office than they were to working for a prosecutor, that, in this position, like you mentioned, we have the power, we have the discretion to do real justice, right? And I think it's incredibly important for people like me who have had just at least a glimpse of that kind of experience with law enforcement to sit in this role, work with police officers every day, work with prosecutors every day, and try to close the gap between what the system is and what it ought to be, what we tell ourselves it ought to be. And it's been a hard thing to do, to be a Latino and a prosecutor now. It didn't used to be that way. When my dad got into this work, it was a position that was just sort of more highly regarded and more highly appreciated. That has sort of eroded. I understand some of the reasons why, but I think it's incredibly important for people like me to have a balanced perspective when it comes to law enforcement.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And so when you got pulled over, you said you were on your way to college. You ended up at Harvard, right? And so I don't know timing-wise, but had you already been accepted to Harvard at that time?
I think I had. I had an acceptance letter.
So they didn't know they were pulling over an Ivy Leaguer.
No,
get on the ground, Crimson guy, and so probably in your mind, it was, doubly humiliating because you had done all this work to get to the place where you were going. You'd already gotten your acceptance letter or, email. So you go to Harvard, and then I saw on there something about the London School of Economics.
Yeah, so I actually when I graduated from Harvard, I didn't, I was young. I didn't want to go back to Albuquerque for the summer, so I actually took a position in the first .com boom in a startup in New York City. I had been accepted to the London School of Economics. I actually, after that summer, they said, well, we're going to go to California and open an office in Silicon Valley. And wasn't actually Silicon Valley, by the way. They opened the office in Burlingame. I never understood why. Maybe they missed it. But in any event, I deferred my year in London and then had my .com experience in 99 and 2000, and then ended up going to London and studying international trade. And I focused on globalization, basically. The impact of global trade on different economic sectors, on the market, and more importantly, on how policy is developed and how those policies impact the sort of evolution of markets across borders. So I did that for a year. I tried to take the LSAT in London, which was a disaster because I don't think the proctors really understood how to time it correctly. And so they cut off a section of a critical section of the LSAT, and I knew it was not going to work out. So you're actually allowed to cancel I don't know if people know this, you can, in the middle of the LSAT, you can stand up and cancel if something goes wrong. So I canceled. It was the last date to apply for the following year. So my whole plan for law school was blown. I went outside, went into a pub and called some friends back home. And long story short, I ended up reconnecting with someone who I'd worked with in the .com who was running the Cesar Chavez Foundation in Los Angeles. Okay. So I ended up being the development officer at the Chavez Foundation, which was wonderful. I got to know members of the family and learn about his legacy and all the work that he had done to try and lift up communities across the country. And then was there just about a year and went on to Stanford Law School after that.
Wow. And so we were just talking that our guest right before you was Dolores Huerta, who actually came out to our law firm. We had her out there for a special event, members of our San Diego La Raza community, and how strong she's still going. And then I saw that on your background, so I thought that was a neat, coming together of worlds. So, I worked for a time at a very large law firm, Latham & Watkins. I was on the recruiting committee. And so, if we saw a guy, Harvard undergraduate, London School of Economics, some interest in international issues, then goes to Stanford Law School, you would be a very, very, very hot ticket for me. Like we would be after you hardcore, especially, underrepresented, part of a large corporate law firm, that you would fulfill. So you could have made a ton of cash, man. So but you took a turn, right? I mean, how come you decided to forego all that money?
The real answer is I had work that I thought needed to be done back home, and I had something to prove. I did spend my first summer in New York at a boutique white collar law firm, and then I worked for rhetoric in San Francisco.
Okay.
For my second summer, and so there was definitely
you were being courted.
Yeah, there was definitely the opportunities were there, but I was, I saw that life of living my life in 6-minute increments and billing time for wealthy clients and big companies, and just thought, why is this really what I went to law school to do? And I got into moot court in Stanford and really decided, this is what I want to be in court. This is what I want to do. And as you know, there's no better training for courtroom fluency and just practice than the criminal justice system. And so that left the public defender's office or the district attorney's office. And I ended up eventually running the largest law office in the state, in the district attorney's office in Albuquerque. But at the time when I was talking to my dad, he said, you should go to one of the rural counties. So I actually ended up in the same county that he started off in when I was a little kid. And there were people there that used to babysit me as a child and they were on the verge of retirement, who saw me come back as a first-year ADA. And I'll never forget, I walked in to this tiny little office. I was making $37,000 a year. Most of my friends at Stanford were making 160, 170. And they're living in London and New York and San Francisco and places like that. And they said, how's Albuquerque? And I said, well, I'm not actually in Albuquerque. You find Albuquerque on a map and then drive south 45 minutes or 30 minutes. But I got what I wanted. I got what I asked for. They handed me a stack of files. And I'll never forget, my secretary said, "In the courthouse, the court's across the street," and that was it. It was like the deep end of the pool. I ended up doing trial work and being assigned to cases that, frankly, had I been in a bigger office, I never would have had the opportunity. The most impactful, and one that I've talked about a fair amount, was the first major felony case I worked on was a shaken baby case. And it involved a little boy who was about 6 months old. And his father had shaken him so violently that he was left permanently impaired, blind, and brain damaged. And it was my job to prepare the experts in that case. And I called my dad in anticipation of the trial, thinking he was going to give me some pointers about how to talk to the judge or enter evidence or do any of that. And he didn't do that. He said, "Have you met this little boy?" And it didn't make any sense to me at the time. And I said, he can't be a witness. He's 2 years old now, and he's impaired. He has no recollection of what happened. He says, "You should do that." And so his foster parents brought him into this little conference room that we called a library, and they put him on in his carrier on the table. And a beautiful little boy, looked like he could be a member of my family. And they got him out. We started talking, and I was playing with him a little bit, but you could slowly tell the impact of what had been done to him. And these foster parents loved him, and they were really dedicated to making him better. And they walked away. They took him home, and I just went outside and I just started crying. And I called my then girlfriend, now wife, and I just said, I made a mistake. I can't do this. I can't. This isn't what I thought it was. And she let me do that for a little bit, and then she says, "Okay, are you done?" and she says, "Look, you went to all these fancy schools and you did all these things. What are you going to do with it, right? That little boy needs somebody in court, to speak for him. And if you're not going to do this for him, who are you going to do it for? And so there was sort of a light switch moment for me, and I went and I dedicated myself and put everything that I had into preparing for that case. And it put me on a path where I became not just a reluctant participant in child abuse cases, but someone who volunteered. I used to go every weekend or every Friday. I would drive up to Albuquerque to the All Faiths Receiving Home and listen to safe house disclosures of little kids, young kids who had been sexually assaulted and physically assaulted. And it just changed me completely. And I can tell you that I never, I still can't, put together or compete with my law school classmates when it comes to the vacations that they go on or the cars that they have or the things that they do. But I wouldn't trade anything that I have done in my career for any of that. And I just get a real sense of satisfaction from feeling like I have in some way done something to help people in my community who desperately need it.
That's amazing and very inspiring. Congratulations for kind of making that choice, to give back. And it's a good segue because, you found that passion for helping children, and some of the most important work you're doing today is for children in New Mexico affected by social media. And so let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, in many respects, the cases that we filed against the social media platforms, first against Meta last year and then against Snap just last week, are really just extensions of the work that I did as a frontline prosecutor so long ago. After I left that district attorney's office, I actually became an assistant attorney general under Patsy Madrid and then Gary King in New Mexico, and I worked in that role as an internet crimes against children prosecutor. I prosecuted child pornography and child solicitation cases. And in those days, you would look for predators and people who were trading this material in sort of dark and hard to find places on the internet. What has changed through the evolution of technology and the rise of social media platforms is all of that has actually migrated not to the darkest corners of the web, but onto platforms that are readily available on devices that everyone in this country has access to, everyone in the world has access to. And I was actually fairly surprised as a former ICAC prosecutor at the ease with which predators were able to use platforms to target and groom and potentially, meet in real life these children who, frankly, didn't understand, I think, the danger associated with this space. I know clearly now that parents don't understand what is going on. I think it's pretty well documented, the mental health and psychological harms that are associated with extensive social media use. And a lot of my colleagues and fellow attorneys general from around the country filed actions focused on that, and we included claims against that as well. But the predation of children and the ease with which people are potentially victimized in these spaces is alarming. By their own account, 100,000 children every single day globally receive sexually explicit material or solicitations for sex sometimes in some form or fashion just on Meta's platforms. 100,000 children a day. After we filed the lawsuit, one of the things that I think is a function of my having been a prosecutor in this space, we actually organized a criminal case called Operation Metaphile. We went on the platform and we did an undercover operation and apprehended 3 men who showed up at a motel in Gallup, New Mexico, thinking they were going to have sex with an underage girl at that motel. And so what we were trying to do in that instance is demonstrate that this threat doesn't just exist in the virtual world and on someone's phone. It actually moves into real life each and every day, and something that these platforms and their executives need to be accountable for.
100%. Thank you for doing that work. What advice would you give because I got kids. We try to super limit their access. Generally speaking, I find that hard to do with a teenager sometimes. But what's the best advice you would give to parents of children to help prevent that in the meanwhile?
Well, look, I'm probably the wrong guy to ask. I'm a prosecutor, a child abuse and sex crimes prosecutor who's the son of a prosecutor. So the advice I'm going to give you is probably a little bit harsher than what most parents are ready for. What I would tell and what I try to tell parents is, you need at a minimum to understand exactly what is on your children's phones, who they're in touch with, how they're using these applications. My own personal view is that social media is not appropriate for anyone under the age of 18. I have a 15-year-old right now that if she heard this podcast, she would be both rolling her eyes and disavowing me to all of her friends. So I recognize that. But given where the lack of oversight by these companies and their awareness that there are predators each and every day in these spaces, I don't think it's safe for children. I don't think it's safe for children to use these platforms at the volume that they do right now. The Surgeon General has issued a call, which we have supported for Congress, to actually mandate a warning label on these things, like we did with cigarettes. And the amount of time that adolescents spend is extraordinarily dangerous, and particularly for the impact that this has on brain development and the addictive nature of it. It's a place that enables sextortion, cyberbullying, and a lot of really dangerous things. From my own part, what we have done is eventually we gave our oldest a phone that is a Bark phone. It's actually I can control the phone. I have to approve every app on the phone, and I'm able to see communications on the phone. So I know exactly what she's saying and who she's communicating with and what apps are available to her or not. That's probably more than a lot of parents feel is necessary, but I think if they saw what I saw each and every day, they would probably be doing the same thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I have a 15-year-old daughter myself, 15-year-old son, twins, and a 17-year-old. And I appreciate your comments because they're going to give me and their mom license to increase scrutiny and control of those communications. And I think probably, not only because of who you are as our guest, but because of what you just said, this may be the most listened to podcast episode we ever have, because every parent that has a teenage kid is going to make their kid listen to this now and say, this is why I'm doing this, kid.
Well, take the complaint that we filed against Meta. It's over 200 pages. We spent days scrubbing images and messages because they were literally too explicit to be included in a public file. So I think there's a distance between when I say, oh, this is dangerous, and parents kind of say, sure it is. Yeah. And here's the thing, if I filled this room with parents and I showed them the unaltered, unredacted images that were being sent and the solicitations that were being sent to what the perpetrators thought was an 11-year-old girl, they would be astonished. They would be horrified. And I frankly think that most of them would be very reluctant to allow their kids to have the kind of access that they do right now.
So, you talked about your children. Is there any hope of or expression of desire to have a third generation of trial lawyer or prosecutor in the family?
Yeah. So let's start with the youngest, my boy. He's not interested in politics. He's not interested in the law, and he's starting to figure out that the stock market looks a lot like a video game. So I think there may be, he's probably going in a different direction. My oldest, my girl, she is a natural born advocate. Let's just say that. She is passionate about a great many things. She is very passionate about immigration. I think because some of her earliest memories were sort of born in the hateful rhetoric that came from former President Trump. And I think that kind of has motivated her to be interested in those issues. And so we'll see if she ends up following in our footsteps. She's also a very gifted artist, so she may go in a different direction, but there's a decent chance that she ends up making a case in court one day.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because I was thinking about talking to you about a subject that kind of combines rhetoric around immigration, around criminal stuff, around politics. And that is, we see lately, and especially when elections roll around, this suggestion that immigrants or particular groups of immigrants are a threat to public safety and, in fact, are the biggest threat of criminal activity, that we can face. And hence, we must shut down the borders, to protect our families and our children. We see some talk of Haitian immigrants, attacking and, eating animals. And, last election cycle, it was MS-13, this great threat from El Salvador. Now we hear in your neighboring state, Texas, this suggestion that this Venezuelan gang is some great threat. How do you view actually being in the seat, looking at criminal activity on a daily basis? How do you see, what I would say is a hijacking of the criminal justice system as a political ploy, to scare mainly white people into having, this anti-immigrant rhetoric that your daughter's so passionate about?
Well, listen, this is a very old political ploy. I would imagine that if you could go back to the Roman Empire, right, there was probably some ill-informed, xenophobic public figure who was pounding on the table about all of the immigrants pouring into Rome and
the Persians,
and who knows what it was, but this is not new, and frankly, it is. It's not just offensive; it's tired and it's played out. Now, as somebody who has worked in law enforcement on the border, including as an assistant United States attorney, I have prosecuted people for criminal reentry. I've done more of those cases than I can count.
1326.
1326.
I
That's
remember
right.
those.
Yeah, I mean, it's just over and over and over again. There's no doubt that we need more enforcement at the border. We need an orderly process at the border. I think we need to create and provide the kinds of resources that we need for immigration judges, Border Patrol agents, investments in technology, all of those things. But we also have to recognize that immigrants in this country, number one, commit crimes at a much lower rate than the native-born Americans.
They're trying to lay low.
They do, and I've seen that time and again. I saw it as district attorney. I would go on radio programs, sometimes conservative talk radio, and they would say, "Oh, it's immigrants driving this crime problem," and I would have to remind them, no. And to your point, the reason for that is most of them are here to try and improve their lives and make things better for the next generation. In other words, they came here for the exact same reasons that every previous generation of immigrants from all over the world have come to try and achieve, because they believe that this is a place where they can have a better life and they can build something for their future. So it's simply not true that they're driving the crime and public safety challenges in our cities. But it is also true that we can't turn a blind eye to chaotic scenes. We have to have a border that is functional, and we have to be able to have a dynamic and thoughtful response to the challenges of a nation that frankly has a declining birth rate. And if you look at this is me now looking back towards my time at the London School of Economics, productivity growth is actually directly connected to your birth rate. So part of the problem, I don't know if you remember the rise of Japan in the 80s and 90s, right?
What happened to them?
What happened to them is a stagnating birth rate, a declining birth rate. There was banking issues and lots of other issues, but that was a place where, in part, the reluctance of the Japanese to open up their country to thoughtful immigration meant that they were destined to lower levels of productivity because they had a lower birth rate. We have the same challenges here. And the question is how we come up with a system that actually enables the best and the brightest from all over the world, not just Latin America, but from all over the world, to come to this country and enrich our country, to enrich our communities, to bring important skills that we need to build a modern economy. We can do that, and we've done it before. But what you are seeing in the rhetoric around immigration in the last 10 years is really, I think, a function of some of the failed agreements and some of the failed perspectives that came to pass in the 90s, right? We had just won the Cold War. We were knocking down barriers to trade. We enacted NAFTA. NAFTA did two things at the same time. Had a devastating impact on the agricultural economy in Mexico, which actually animated and promoted more immigration. It also devastated and undermined manufacturing and industrial communities across the upper Midwest. And so when someone like former President Trump goes into Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio and places that used to have thriving manufacturing economies, it is absolutely true that those communities were devastated when those businesses pulled up and went to Mexico. And so it's an easy case in those communities to make, hey, not only did your government sell you out by shipping these jobs over to Mexico, but now we have people coming over the border, right? There's a trauma that occurred in these communities, and now a simple, bigoted answer to all of the country's challenges resonates with people. And I think the challenge for Democrats in this environment is not just to reject hateful, bigoted language that tries to ostracize a community and demean a community, but also to recognize and ask ourselves hard questions about why that rhetoric is resonating with fellow citizens, right? And I think sometimes we have a hard time doing that. We have a hard time recognizing how much has happened in those places that used to have these mill towns and small factories where people could have a great middle-class life. Now they feel like they've been left behind, and this is part of what sort of prompted me to study globalization nearly 25 years ago, and grappling and dealing with that is at the heart of the dynamics that you're seeing unfold right now. And I think the Democratic Party really needs to be thoughtful about how it approaches international trade and immigration, because here's the last point. We have a tendency, especially in this country, to only think about what's going on in the political and economic spheres that are impacting our day-to-day lives. What we are not recognizing, though, is that this same argument, you're seeing the rise of anti-immigrant rhetoric and right-wing authoritarianism all over the world. It's happening in Europe. It's happening all over the world. So that should tell us something about this isn't just a function or a feature of Donald Trump and his rhetoric. It's a function of a failed economic worldview that didn't fully account for how destructive these new policies would be to communities on the margins. And how we have a conversation that respects the dignity of an aspiring immigrant community while also respecting the dignity of folks in hard-hit towns in Ohio and Michigan. That's the challenge for modern leaders in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it's a tough issue. I agree. You came over here to Texas to talk to us from New Mexico at a time, I don't know if you know this, but the state of Texas recently had their, I think, State National Guard go out and install razor wire on the state border, not the international border, the state border between New Mexico and Texas. Are you aware of that?
I am, and they were so incompetent in doing it that there was some.
Were you able to get through?
Well, yeah. I somehow managed to get here, but aside from that, they actually didn't have their lines and their maps correct, so they were actually laying wire separating Texas from Texas at certain points. So, it's again, it is another example of this kind of pathetic modern phenomenon of political theater, right? Masquerading as real policy. That's what this is. It's not in any way an attempt to either solve that crisis or come up with a thoughtful response to a complicated issue. It's just theater and sound and fury signifying nothing. It's also, as my some of my people would say, just tonteria. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. There's a some of it was the laying of razor wire along the river right next to a bridge. So literally somebody could walk across the bridge and take a look at the razor wire. It's just dumb, right? And I think people are tired of dumb political theater. I think there is a yearning in this country for serious people who just want to make things work and have hard conversations. And frankly, what that's going to mean is being able to find some consensus between evolving but very different views of how the world should be organized. And that's what was such a tragedy about this latest bill that was proposed by Congress, that was negotiated with very conservative members of the Republican caucus. It was a significant bill. It would have had, I think, an impact on what was going on at the border and put us on a more sustainable path. President Biden said he would sign it. Former President Trump, issued a call to kill that bill. Not because he disagreed with the policy, but because he wanted to run on this empty, hateful rhetoric. And I just think people are worn out, because there was a time when American government was capable of tackling big challenges and big problems in an unwieldy and very diverse nation. And I think we're looking for a return to that sense of what is possible.
Yeah, I agree completely. And so kind of in closing, what advice, we have a lot of listeners and viewers that are maybe, law students, younger people thinking about law, maybe, new lawyers, thinking about what they'd like to do. I like to think a lot of our, viewers and listeners are of Latino descent. What advice would you give to them to have a happy, successful, and fulfilling life and career?
Well, listen, you have to be mindful of why it is that you started walking down this road to begin with. To your earlier question about what was on the table in terms of salary and money and all of those things, I have dear friends of mine who made a choice early in their career, either to get rid of debt or do other things, that they were going to go down that path. And if you're not mindful, that short detour to trying to pay down your debt or do those sorts of things becomes a life. And I get it, right? Especially when you're young. It's nice to have the ability to do things that you weren't able to, especially for young Latino lawyers who probably are coming from backgrounds oftentimes where they didn't have those things. But you get to a certain point in your life where the measure of what you have accomplished is not found in what you have. It's sort of measured by what you've done. And what that really means is, was seen in an early memory that I had with people who had come up to my dad in the community. They would kind of tap him on the shoulder or pull him aside, and they would have a private conversation, and they would oftentimes be crying, and I didn't really know what it was. And it dawned on me later on that those were victims. Those were family members of people who he had tried to help. And I know that happens in private practice, and I applaud it when it does. But when we're all going to go to the same place, we're all going to end our journey in the same way. And if we're lucky, people are going to gather around and they're going to share stories about what it meant and what you meant. And they're probably not going to share stories about that deposition that you argued, better than the next lawyer, or that contract that you wrote that really, handled that one issue that your client was worried about. It's going to be what impact you had in the world. And so even if you've decided that public service and public interest isn't your path, then take the time to do important pro bono work. Take the time to give back. Take the time to, if you're going to focus on building that practice, well, what is my legacy outside of the practice? What groups did I help? What children did I lift up? What communities have I served and saved in some important way? Because, from my perspective, that's all that really matters, are the stories that they tell on the day after you leave.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. I can't think of a better way to end our conversation with that. And so thank you, sir, for spending the time with us. Super appreciate it. This concludes this episode of the Latino, where we talk about the intersection of the law and our Latino communities. Look forward to our next episode and having you join us. But thank you again, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Latino podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.